Montana Territory. Late autumn, 1886. Nobody noticed what was happening beneath that cabin on the eastern slope of the Crazy Mountains. From the outside, it looked like any other homestead: weathered timber, a stone chimney trailing smoke into the gray sky, a small barn barely standing against the wind. But underneath, something was being built that would soon become the difference between life and death. Margaret Thorne was doing something people thought was strange. Some called it foolish. Others didn't bother calling it anything at all. They just shook their heads and kept walking. But by the end of that winter, the strangest decision would become the smartest one anyone in Maher County had ever witnessed. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the solution everyone mocked became the technique everyone copied. And if you want to learn one real survival technique every single week, techniques that actually worked when people's lives depended on them, hit that subscribe button right now. Comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? Now, let's go back to the moment it all began. Margaret Thorne wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She was trying to survive. At 34 years old, she'd been a widow for 2 winters. Her husband, a timber surveyor, had died in a logging accident near the Musselshell River in the spring of 1884. She was left with 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, a half-finished cabin, and 40 acres of land that produced more wind than wheat. She knew timber. She'd grown up watching her father frame barns in Pennsylvania, and she'd helped her husband split logs for 3 years before he died. People in the valley respected her carpentry, even if they didn't respect much else about a woman running a homestead alone. The problem wasn't the cabin itself. The problem was the floor. Every morning that first winter as a widow, Margaret woke to ice on the inside of the walls. The children slept as close to the hearth as they dared, bundled in wool and hides, and still they shivered. She burned through cords of wood faster than her neighbors, and yet the cabin never felt warm. The heat rose straight up and out through the roof. The cold crawled up through the floorboards. She tried everything the old-timers recommended. She packed moss between the logs. She hung canvas inside to block drafts. She spread straw under the beds. Nothing worked. The floor was only 8 inches above bare ground, and the wind cut underneath like a river of ice. By February of 1886, her daughter had a cough that wouldn't quit. The boy's fingers turned white at the tips. Margaret spent entire nights feeding the fire, dozing in a chair, waking every hour to add more wood. She was burning 4 cord a month. Her neighbors were burning 3. One night, in early March, she stood outside and looked at the cabin from a distance. Smoke poured from the chimney. Light glowed through the oiled paper windows. And she realized all that heat was fighting the cold from the wrong direction. Heat rises. Cold sinks. She couldn't win by pushing heat down. She needed to go where the cold couldn't reach. She needed to go underground. Margaret had heard stories. Settlers on the plains dug, sawed houses halfway into the earth. Miners carved bunk rooms into hillsides. She'd even traded with a trapper who said the Crow people used lodges that sat low to the ground, sheltered by the land itself. It wasn't madness. It was physics. 3 days later, she started digging. She chose a spot directly beneath the back corner of the cabin, under what had been the storage area. She pulled up the floorboards, one by one, and set them aside. Then she took a shovel and began excavating. 6 feet down. That was the goal. The first 2 feet were easy, loose topsoil and clay. After that, she hit harder ground, mixed with stones the size of her fist. She hauled each shovelful up through the opening, dumping it in a pile outside. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. The children watched from the edge of the hole, silent and curious. It took her 3 weeks to dig the room. 6 feet deep, 8 feet wide, 10 feet long. The walls were raw earth, held back by planks salvaged from an old hay shed. She lined the floor with flat stones pulled from the creek bed. She cut 2 support beams from pine logs and wedged them under the cabin's floor joists to keep everything from collapsing inward. For the ceiling, she used the original floorboards, reinforced with crossbeams. She left one section removable, a trapdoor, hinged with leather straps and counterweight with a stone. She drilled a ventilation hole up through the corner of the cabin and fitted it with a tin pipe that rose through the roof, capped with a simple hood to keep out rain. The room was dark. It smelled like wet clay and old timber, and it was warmer than anywhere else on the property. At 6 feet below the surface, the ground held a steady temperature. It didn't freeze in winter. It didn't bake in summer. The earth itself became insulation. The stones on the floor absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night. There were no drafts, no wind, no gaps for the cold to crawl through. Margaret moved 2 straw mattresses down into the space. She hung a lantern from a ceiling beam. She brought down wool blankets, a water jug, a wooden crate for clothes. The children descended through the trapdoor on a ladder made of split saplings. That first night underground, the boys said it felt like sleeping in a cave. The girls said it was too quiet. Margaret didn't say anything. She just listened to them breathe, steady, deep, without coughing. The next morning, she woke to stillness. No wind howling through gaps. No ice on the walls. The lantern had gone out hours before, but the room wasn't freezing. It was cool, yes, but it was livable. Margaret climbed back up into the main cabin and relit the hearth. She realized something that would change everything. She didn't need to heat the whole cabin anymore. She only needed to heat the space where they worked and cooked. At night, they would descend. The earth would do the rest. It was the simplest solution she'd ever built, and nobody understood it. Margaret Thorne didn't write down what she was doing. She didn't sketch plans or consult engineers. She built by instinct and necessity, the way people did when failure meant freezing. But what she created, whether she realized it or not, was a functional example of passive thermal design. The underground room worked because of 3 principles: thermal mass, earth insulation, and stable ground temperature. Let's start with thermal mass. The stones Margaret laid on the floor weren't just decoration. Stone, clay, and packed earth absorb heat slowly and release it just as slowly. During the day, warmth from the cabin above, or from a small fire she occasionally lit in a clay pot, soaked into those stones. At night, when temperatures dropped, the stones radiated that stored heat back into the air. It was a battery made of geology. Above ground, wood cabins had almost no thermal mass. The walls, floor, and roof were thin layers of timber. They heated fast and cooled fast. The moment the fire died, the cold took over. Underground, the opposite was true. The earth surrounding the room, on all sides, acted like a blanket that never moved. Heat stayed trapped. Cold stayed locked out. Then there was the ground itself. At 6 feet below the surface, soil temperature remains relatively constant year-round, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on location and climate. In Montana's high plains, that meant the ground at that depth hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the dead of winter, when surface temperatures plunged to -30 or -40. Margaret wasn't heating the room from scratch every night. She was starting from 50 degrees. The earth did half the work before she even struck a match. The design wasn't complicated. The room was a simple rectangular excavation with vertical walls and a flat ceiling. The walls were shored up with rough-cut planks to prevent cave-ins, and the corners were reinforced with stacked stones. The ceiling was the original cabin floor, now doubling as a structural cap over the underground space. The trapdoor measured 3 feet by 2 feet, just wide enough for an adult to climb through. It opened on leather hinges and could be propped from below with a notched stick. When closed, it sat flush with the cabin floor, covered by a woven mat. Most visitors never noticed it. Ventilation was critical. Without airflow, the room would become a suffocating pit. Margaret solved this by driving a 6-inch tin pipe from the underground ceiling up through the cabin roof. The pipe rose about 4 feet above the roofline and was capped with a simple angled hood to keep out rain and snow. Air moved naturally through the pipe, warm, moist air rising out, cool, fresh air seeping in through small gaps around the trapdoor. It wasn't perfect. On the coldest nights, frost formed inside the ventilation pipe. Occasionally, condensation dripped from the ceiling beams. But compared to the bone-cracking cold of the cabin above, it was a miracle. Margaret added one more feature that spring, a small firebox. She built it in the corner farthest from the trapdoor, using flat stones and clay mortar. The firebox was only 2 feet wide and a foot deep, just large enough for a handful of kindling or a few split logs. The smoke vented up through a separate clay pipe that joined the main ventilation shaft near the roof. She didn't use the firebox often. On most nights, the residual warmth from the earth and the thermal mass of the stones was enough. But on the nights when the temperature dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, she'd light a small fire before bed. The heat would spread through the room, absorbed by the stone floor and earthen walls, and linger for hours after the flames died. The whole system used 1/3 the firewood of a conventional cabin hearth, maybe less. By April of 1886, Margaret had spent nearly every night underground for 2 months. The children were healthier. The cough was gone. Their skin had color again. She was sleeping through the night for the first time since her husband died. But nobody asked her how she was doing it. Nobody came to see the room. And when people didn't notice the pile of dirt outside her cabin, they assumed she was digging a root cellar. Margaret didn't correct them. She had work to do. The garden needed planting. The fence needed mending. And summer, as always, would be brief. What she didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that the room she'd carved into the earth would soon be the only reason she and her children survived the winter of 1887. People talked. They always did. Margaret Thorne had learned to ignore most of it. The whispers about a widow living alone. The sideways glances when she bought nails at the mercantile. The unsolicited advice from men who assumed she didn't know a joist from a rafter. But the underground room, that brought a different kind of attention. It started in late spring, after the snow melted and neighbors began visiting again. A man named Caleb Rust, who ran a small cattle operation 2 miles south, stopped by to trade seed. He noticed a mound of excavated dirt piled near the back of the cabin. "Digging a cellar?" he asked. "Something like that," Margaret said. Russ walked over and nudged the dirt with his boot. "That's a lot of earth for a root cellar. You planning to store half the valley down there?" Margaret didn't answer. She just handed him the bag of seed and walked back inside. Russ told his wife that night. His wife told her sister. Her sister told the family that ran the dry goods store in Martinsdale. By June, the story had spread across the county. The Thorne widow was digging something strange under her cabin. Some said it was a cellar. Others said it was a burrow. One old-timer joked that she was prospecting for gold in her own dirt floor. Nobody thought it was a bedroom. In July, a traveling carpenter named Elias Drummond passed through the area looking for work. He'd built barns and cabins all over the territory, and he had opinions about everything. Someone mentioned Margaret's project at the Martinsdale Saloon. Drummond laughed. "She's sleeping underground?" "That's what I heard," said the bartender. "Good lumber wasted on a hole," Drummond muttered, shaking his head. "That woman's lost her sense." Word got back to Margaret, as it always did. She didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that defending yourself only made people talk more. Instead, she focused on what mattered. The children were healthy, the roof didn't leak, and she had enough firewood stacked for the coming winter. But the comments didn't stop. A neighbor woman named Beatrice Calhoun visited in late August under the pretense of borrowing a canning pot. She stayed for tea and spent the entire time glancing at the floor, trying to spot the trapdoor. Finally, she asked outright, "Is it true you sleep below the cabin?" Margaret nodded. "In the winter, yes." "Like animals?" Beatrice's voice was quiet, but the judgment was clear. "Like people trying to stay warm," Margaret said. Beatrice left without the pot. At the general store in September, Margaret overheard 2 men talking while she waited to pay for flour. One of them was a freight hauler named Raymond Oakes. The other was someone she didn't recognize. "I don't care what she does," Oakes said, "but that's no way to raise children. Sleeping in the dirt like foxes in a den." The other man chuckled. "Maybe she's gone feral." Margaret set the flour on the counter, paid, and left without a word. The truth was, most people didn't care enough to be cruel. They just thought it was odd. Foolish, maybe a little desperate. The kind of thing you did when you didn't have the money or the sense to build properly. Margaret knew better. She'd spent 2 winters fighting the cold in a conventional cabin, burning through cords of wood and watching her children get sick. She'd spent 1 winter underground, sleeping soundly and using half the fuel. The numbers didn't lie, but numbers didn't change minds. People believed what they could see. and what they saw was a widow digging holes under her house. By October, the mockery had softened into indifference. People stopped asking. The novelty wore off. Life in the valley moved on. Fences mended, livestock moved to winter pasture, supplies stockpiled for the cold months ahead. Margaret went about her work in silence. She repaired the trapdoor hinges. She added a second layer of stones to the underground floor. She patched a crack in the ventilation pipe. She split firewood and stacked it under a tarp near the cabin's south wall. She didn't talk about the room anymore. She didn't explain. And when the first snow fell in early November, she descended through the trapdoor with her children and closed it behind her, shutting out the cold and the whispers and the doubt. By January, none of that would matter. By January, the only thing that would matter was whether you could survive the night. It began on January 12th, 1887, and it didn't stop for 3 days. The people of Montana Territory had seen hard winters before. Cold snaps that froze rivers solid. Snows that buried fences and drifted over rooftops. Winds that howled through valleys and stripped the bark off trees. But what arrived in the second week of January was something different. Something worse. Meteorologists would later call it part of the Great Die-Up, a series of storms that killed hundreds of thousands of cattle across the northern plains and bankrupted ranches from the Dakotas to Wyoming. Settlers called it the Death Winter, and the children who lived through it, the ones who survived, would remember it for the rest of their lives as the blizzard that turned the world white and silent and deadly. It started with wind. On the morning of January 12th, the temperature in Meagher County was a manageable 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was overcast but calm. Margaret woke early, fed the fire in the hearth, and made cornmeal mush for the children. Everything seemed normal. By noon, the wind had picked up. By 2 in the afternoon, it was howling. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour. Then another 10. By sunset, it was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit and falling fast. Snow began to fall. Not the soft, gentle flakes of November, but hard, cutting ice crystals that stung exposed skin and piled into drifts faster than anyone could shovel. Margaret stood at the cabin door and watched the storm roll in from the north. The sky was the color of charcoal. The wind bent the pine trees at the edge of the property until their tops nearly touched the ground. She could barely see the barn, and it was only 30 yards away. She bolted the door, checked the chimney damper, and added 2 more logs to the fire. Then she gathered the children and told them what they already knew. They were going underground tonight. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was gusting at 60 miles per hour. Snow piled against the cabin's north wall until it reached the eaves. Inside, the fire roared, but the cold crept in any way, through gaps in the logs, around the window frames, up through the floorboards. Margaret fed the fire one last time, then opened the trapdoor. The children climbed down first, carrying blankets and a jug of water. Margaret followed, pulling the trapdoor shut behind her and latching it from below with a wooden peg. The contrast was immediate. Above ground, the wind screamed. The walls creaked and groaned. The fire crackled and spat. Below, there was silence. The earth swallowed the sound. The temperature in the underground room was 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, but not dangerous. Not killing. Margaret lit the small firebox in the corner and added a few pieces of kindling. The flames caught quickly, and warmth began to spread across the stone floor. The children curled up on their mattresses, wrapped in wool, and within an hour they were asleep. Margaret stayed awake, listening. Above, the storm raged. She could hear the wind, even through 6 feet of earth and timber. It sounded distant, like a train passing far away. Occasionally, something, a branch, maybe, or a piece of debris, slammed against the cabin's outer wall. But down here, in the dark, with the firelight flickering against the clay walls, it felt almost peaceful. She fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning. When she woke, the fire had gone out, but the room was still warm. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, Margaret climbed up through the trapdoor to check the main cabin. Snow had drifted through cracks around the door and piled in the corners. The hearth was cold. Ice coated the inside of the windows. The temperature inside the cabin was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. barely warmer than outside. She added wood to the hearth and relit it, but the fire struggled. The draft was weak. The cold was too strong. She stayed long enough to boil water for tea, then carried it back down through the trapdoor and sealed the room again. On the third day, the wind finally stopped. Margaret climbed up into the cabin and looked outside. The world was buried. Drifts rose 10 feet high against the north side of the cabin. The barn was half hidden. The fence line had vanished. The sky was clear, and the temperature had dropped even further. The thermometer outside the door read -42 degrees Fahrenheit. She could see smoke rising from chimneys across the valley, thin, desperate trails. But some cabins had no smoke at all. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It was Caleb Rust, the cattleman from 2 miles south. His face was red and chapped. His beard was crusted with ice. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "You got room for 2 more?" he asked. Margaret stepped aside, and Rust stumbled in, followed by his teenage son. Both of them were shaking. "Our cabin's freezing," Rust said, his voice hoarse. "We burned every stick of what we had." The boy's fingers are turning black. "I didn't know where else to go." Margaret didn't ask why he'd chosen her cabin. She just pointed to the trapdoor. "Down there," she said. "It's warm." Rust stared at the floor. "The hole." "Yes." He hesitated. Then his son coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and Rust made his decision. He lifted the trapdoor and climbed down. "Stay with me, because what happened next changed how people thought about shelter." When Rust emerged 2 hours later, his hands had stopped shaking. His son was asleep on one of the mattresses, wrapped in borrowed blankets. Rust looked at Margaret with something close to disbelief. "It's 50 degrees down there," he said. "About that," Margaret replied. "We burned 30 cords getting through December. You're barely touching your woodpile." "I don't need to," she said. "The ground does most of the work." Rust stood there for a long moment, staring at the trapdoor. Then he looked at Margaret. "I called you crazy. I know. I was wrong." Margaret didn't respond. She just closed the door and went back to making supper. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. By nightfall, it was -45 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest night of the century. And beneath a widow's cabin, in a room carved from clay and stone, 5 people slept through it without a fire. Word traveled slowly in the winter of 1887, but it traveled. Caleb Rust left Margaret's cabin 2 days after the blizzard passed, carrying his son on horseback through snow that came up to the animal's chest. Before he left, he stood at the door and asked a question that would change everything. "Can I bring others?" Margaret looked at him. "If they need it, they will," Rust said. He was right. Within a week, 4 more families had knocked on Margaret Thorne's door. A trapper and his wife, whose dugout had collapsed under the weight of snow. A pair of brothers whose cabin chimney had failed, filling their home with smoke. An elderly couple from a homestead near the Musselshell River whose firewood had run out on the 4th day of the storm. Each time, Margaret opened the trapdoor and let them descend. Each time, they emerged hours later looking stunned. The underground room became a kind of warming station. People didn't stay long. A few hours, sometimes overnight, just long enough to stop shaking, to warm their core temperature, to remember what it felt like to breathe without pain. And each time someone climbed back up through that trapdoor, they asked the same questions. How is it so warm down there? Why isn't the fire going? How much wood does this take? Margaret answered patiently, explaining the principles she'd learned by trial and error. The insulation of 6 feet of earth. The stable temperature of the ground itself. The thermal mass of stone absorbing and releasing heat. The minimal fuel required to supplement what the earth provided for free. But it was the numbers that convinced people. Numbers they could see, measure, and compare. One of the brothers, a man named Jacob Finch who worked as a surveyor, carried a mercury thermometer. On the coldest night of the blizzard, when the temperature outside had dropped to -45 degrees Fahrenheit, he took measurements in 3 places. Outside, -45 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the main cabin, with a fire burning in the hearth, 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the underground room, with no fire at all, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Finch wrote the numbers in his field journal. He showed them to his brother. Then he showed them to Caleb Rust. Then he showed them to anyone who would listen. The difference was undeniable. The underground room was 30 degrees warmer than the heated cabin above it, and it required no fuel. But temperature wasn't the only advantage. Margaret's neighbors, the ones who'd survived the blizzard in conventional cabins, had burned through their entire winter supply of firewood in less than 2 weeks. Some had resorted to burning furniture, fence posts, even floorboards. The cold had been relentless, and the only way to fight it was to feed the fire constantly, day and night, until there was nothing left to burn. Margaret, by contrast, had barely touched her woodpile. She estimated she'd burned 1 cord during the entire storm, and most of that was used to heat the main cabin during the day for cooking and washing. At night, underground, she'd used maybe 10 pounds of kindling total across 3 days. The math was staggering. Her neighbors had consumed 15 to 20 cords in 2 weeks. Margaret had used one. Finch did the calculation. If Margaret's system held up for the rest of the winter, she would use approximately 60% less firewood than a conventional cabin of the same size. Maybe more. 60%, Finch said, standing in Margaret's cabin a week after the storm. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between surviving and freezing. Caleb, Russ nodded. It's the difference between keeping your livestock fed and burning your barn. Margaret said nothing. She just handed Finch a cup of coffee and went back to mending her son's torn coat. But the revelation was only beginning. In late January, another family arrived, this time from a homestead 12 miles north. The father, a mason named Owen Pritchard, had heard rumors about the underground room and wanted to see it for himself. Margaret let him descend through the trapdoor. He stayed down there for an hour, walking the perimeter, tapping the walls, inspecting the stone floor, examining the ventilation shaft. When he climbed back up, his face was thoughtful. "The air's not stale," he said. "No," Margaret said. "It vents through the pipe, and there's no condensation on the ceiling. Not much. It drips sometimes, but not often." Pritchard ran a hand along the edge of the trapdoor. "You built this yourself?" "Yes." "No help." "No help." He nodded slowly. "I've built root cellars that collapsed. I've seen dugouts that flooded. I've watched sod houses sag and rot. But this is sound." Margaret didn't respond. She'd learned that silence was often better than pride. Pritchard left that afternoon, but he came back 3 days later with a proposal. He wanted to build something similar on his own property, and he wanted Margaret's advice. In exchange, he'd help her reinforce the underground room, add better drainage, improve the ventilation, shore up the walls with mortared stone instead of raw planks. Margaret agreed, not because she needed the help, but because she understood what Pritchard was really asking, permission to copy what she'd done. And she had no interest in keeping it secret. Over the next 2 weeks, Pritchard returned 4 times. He brought his oldest son, a boy of 16, and together they worked on Margaret's room, turning it from a functional shelter into something more permanent. They lined the walls with dry stacked stone. They dug a shallow drainage trench along the perimeter to catch any seeping groundwater. They replaced the leather hinges on the trapdoor with iron. And while they worked, Pritchard asked questions. How deep should the room be? What kind of stone worked best? How much ventilation was needed? Should the firebox be built into the wall or freestanding? Margaret answered every question. She didn't hold anything back. She explained what had worked, what hadn't, and what she'd change if she had to build it again. By mid-February, Pritchard had started digging his own underground room. By March, 3 other families in the valley were doing the same. Margaret's invention, though she would never have called it that, was spreading. But the most revealing moment came in early April, after the worst of the winter had passed and people began tallying the damage. Caleb Russ stopped by one afternoon with a ledger. He'd been keeping records all winter: fuel consumption, livestock losses, structural damage, illness, and deaths. It was grim reading. Across Marr County, 17 people had died during the blizzard, most from exposure or hypothermia. Hundreds of cattle had frozen or starved. Dozens of cabins had sustained severe damage, collapsed roofs, cracked foundations, destroyed chimneys. But in the 12-mile radius around Margaret's homestead, the area where word of the underground room had spread fastest, the numbers were different. 0 deaths. 3 cabins with minor damage. Fuel consumption down an average of 50% compared to previous winters. Russ showed Margaret the numbers. "You save lives," he said simply. Margaret looked at the ledger, but didn't touch it. "The ground saved lives," she said. "I just dug the hole." Russ smiled, the first time she'd seen him smile all winter. "You dug the right hole." Spring came late in 1887. The snow didn't fully melt until May, and even then, the ground stayed cold and hard for weeks. But as the world thawed, something new was taking root across the Montana Territory. People were digging. By June, 8 families within a 20-mile radius of Margaret Thorne's cabin had completed underground rooms. Some were simple excavations beneath existing structures, like Margaret's. Others were more elaborate, stone-lined chambers with separate entrances, vaulted ceilings, built-in storage alcoves, and dual ventilation shafts. Owen Pritchard, the mason, had built the most impressive version. His underground room was 10 feet deep, lined entirely with mortared sandstone, and featured a masonry heater, a small, efficient stove designed to burn would slowly and radiate heat for hours after the fire died. He invited Margaret to see it in July. "It stays at 55 degrees without any fire at all," Pritchard said, standing at the entrance. "On cold nights, I'll light the heater for an hour, and it holds warmth until morning." Margaret descended the stone steps and walked through the space. It was larger than hers, more refined, better ventilated. But the principle was the same: let the earth do the work. "You improved it," she said. "I learned from you," Pritchard replied. By the end of 1887, the technique had spread beyond Maher County. Settlers in the Judith Basin were digging winter rooms. Ranchers near Fort Benton were excavating shelters for hired hands. Families along the Musselshell River were building hybrid structures, half cabin, half dugout, that combined the best of both worlds. The technique even reached the Dakota Territory. A circuit-riding preacher who'd spent a night in Margaret's underground room carried the story east, sharing it with homesteaders in the Badlands. By 1888, Montana-style winter rooms were being documented in territorial land office records from Wyoming to the Canadian border. Not everyone called them that. Some people called them dugouts. Others called them earth shelters or root cellars, even though they weren't used for storage. A few families, embarrassed by the idea of sleeping underground, built separate structures away from the main cabin and called them winter sheds. But the name didn't matter. What mattered was the principle. When you couldn't afford to burn more wood and you couldn't build thicker walls, you borrowed warmth from the only place that never ran out: the ground itself. Margaret Thorne never sought recognition for what she'd done. She didn't write letters to newspapers or demonstrate her design at county fairs. She simply lived her life, raised her children, and continued to refine her underground room year after year. But people remembered. In the winter of 1889, a journalist from Helena visited Maher County to write about the lingering effects of the Great Die-Up. He interviewed ranchers, merchants, and surviving settlers. And nearly everyone he spoke to mentioned the same thing: the widow who dug a room under her cabin and proved that the best way to fight the cold wasn't to burn more fuel, it was to stop fighting altogether. The journalist never published the story. His editor thought it was too regional, too specific, too strange. But his notes survived, preserved in the archives of the Montana Historical Society. In those notes, he described Margaret's underground room in detail, calling it a vernacular solution born of necessity and validated by catastrophe. He also included a quote from Caleb Rust, the cattleman who'd been one of the first to take shelter there. "We thought she was foolish," Rust said. "We thought she'd lost her mind. But she understood something the rest of U.S. didn't. You don't survive winter by forcing heat into a cold space. You survive by finding a space that refuses to get cold." Margaret lived on her homestead until 1903, when her children were grown and she sold the property to a young family from Minnesota. The underground room was still intact. The new owners used it for 2 winters before deciding to expand it, digging a second chamber and connecting the two with a short tunnel. The cabin itself burned down in 1911, struck by lightning during a summer storm. But the underground room survived. It was still there in 1925 when a team of agricultural surveyors passed through the area and noted its existence in their field reports. It was still there in 1950 when a local historian photographed the entrance, now partially collapsed but still recognizable. It may still be there today, hidden beneath 40 years of grass and soil and snow. Or it may have caved in long ago, reclaimed by the same earth that once kept a widow and her children alive. But the idea, the simple, undeniable logic of using the ground as insulation, never disappeared. Throughout the 20th century, variations of Margaret's design continued to surface. During the Great Depression, families in the Dust Bowl dug underground rooms to escape the heat. During World War II, rural communities in cold climates built earth-sheltered housing to conserve fuel for the war effort. In the 1970s, the Back to the Land movement rediscovered passive solar and earth-sheltered architecture, often without realizing they were reviving techniques that homesteaders had used a century earlier. Margaret Thorne didn't invent earth-sheltered housing. Indigenous peoples across North America, the Mandan, the Pawnee, the Inuit, the Haida, had been using similar principles for thousands of years. Sod houses, pit houses, and semi-subterranean lodges were common long before European settlers arrived. What Margaret did was rediscover those principles out of necessity, adapt them to her circumstances, and prove, through one brutal winter, that they worked. She wasn't an engineer. She wasn't an architect. She was a widow with 2 children, a pile of dirt, and a problem that needed solving. And she solved it the way people have always solved problems when their lives depend on it, by paying attention to what works, ignoring what doesn't, and trusting the ground beneath their feet. The lesson isn't complicated. It's not about building codes or modern materials or expensive technology. It's about understanding that the best insulation is often the one you're already standing on. That heat doesn't always have to be created. Sometimes it just needs to be preserved. And that the coldest night of your life might be survived not by burning more, but by digging deeper. Margaret Thorne understood that. And by the time the snow melted in the spring of 1887, so did everyone else in Mauer County. The earth remembers, even when we forget. Now, tell me, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Comment below. And if you want one real survival technique every single week, techniques that kept people alive when it mattered most, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the wisdom isn't lost. It's just buried. And sometimes, all you have to do is dig. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.